Nvidia recently launched the refreshed super version of the RTX 2060 and 2070. So what are the differences between them, and is it worth paying more for the 2070 Super? Let's find out in this comparison. Let's take a look at how the 2060 Super and 2070 Super differ in terms of specs. Note that things like clock speed will vary between specific cards. These are just the reference specs for each model. The 2070 Super has 17% more CUDA cores than the 2060 Super, as well as higher base and boost clock speeds. Otherwise, they both have the same 8GB of GDDR6 memory running at the same speeds. For the testing, I'm using the MSI Gaming X version of both the RTX 2060 Super and 2070 Super, so results should be fairly comparable. And both do have a small out-of-the-box overclock, so expect slightly different results with different models. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU overclocked to 5.1 GHz on all cores in an MSI Z390 Ace motherboard, along with 16GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 memory running in dual channel. You can find links in the description for details on all of the components as well as for up-to-date pricing. Let's start out with Battlefield 5. I've tested it with Ultra settings and RTX off. The two bars at the top are 1440p results for each card, then 1080p results are below. At 1080p, the 2070 Super was 13% ahead of the 2060 Super, rising up to a 15% lead at 1440p. With RTX on, the 2070 Super is still around 11% faster than the 2060 Super, and both were playable at 1080p. Granted, I am also using max settings here. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with the built-in benchmark at max settings, and this test tends to be more CPU heavy, which likely explains why it saw the smallest difference between these two GPUs out of all games tested. The 2070 Super was just 3% faster in average FPS, so hardly a difference at all. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested with the built-in benchmark at highest settings. As this test seems to be more GPU heavy, it's not surprising that this game saw the largest improvement with the 2070 Super out of all titles tested, with a 17% higher average frame rate at 1080p and 18% higher at 1440p. Far Cry New Dawn was also tested with the built-in benchmark at Ultra settings. In this test, the 2070 Super was coming out 13% ahead of the 2060 Super both at 1080p and 1440p resolutions, with similar changes to 1% low performance. Fortnite was tested with the replay feature, and although the replay file wasn't exactly the same due to how frequently the game updates, I test with the same pass through the game, so the results should still be comparable. In this game, the 2070 Super was 12% faster in terms of average FPS at 1080p and 13% faster at 1440p. Typically, I find The Witcher 3 to be somewhat GPU heavy. However, even at Ultra settings, there wasn't that much of a difference between these two. The 2070 Super was 8% ahead at 1080p, and then just 5% ahead at 1440p, with an even smaller difference in 1% lows. Ghost Recon Wildlands was tested with the built-in benchmark with Ultra settings. The 2070 Super was almost averaging 60 FPS at 1440p. Putting it 12% ahead of the 2060 Super, with a lower 9% lead when it came to 1080p. In general, I've found Watch Dogs 2 to be a CPU-heavy game, and even with our overclocked 8700K, there was only a 6% boost to average FPS at 1080p with the 2070 Super, and closer to an 8% increase at 1440p. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the built-in benchmark at Ultra settings with a 100% render scale, and this game saw the second biggest increase with the 2070 Super out of all games tested, coming out 15% ahead of the 2060 Super in average frame rate. CSGO was tested with the Uletical FPS benchmark at maximum settings, and although this is typically a CPU-bound game, there was still a 10% improvement to be had with the 2070 Super at both 1080p and 1440p resolutions. In terms of overall improvement, over all 11 tests at maximum settings with a 1080p resolution, on average, the RTX 2070 Super was performing 10.7% better when compared against the RTX 2060 Super in terms of average FPS. As you can see, it really varies and depends on the specific game. CPU-heavier tests like Assassin's Creed and Watch Dogs saw smaller changes, while more GPU-heavy tests like Shadow of the Tomb Raider performed much better comparatively. At 1440p, on average over the same 11 tests, the RTX 2070 Super was now 11.4% ahead of the RTX 2060 Super. In general, we're seeing a larger difference between the two, as 1440p will be more GPU intensive when compared with 1080p. I'd consider either graphics card to be capable at 1440p in most of these games too, especially if you're willing to lower the settings a bit, as I've tested the worst case with highest setting presets here. As for the differences in total system power draw, the system with the 2070 Super was using 52 more watts while running The Witcher 3 at 1440p with ultra settings. This is 18% more power for a game that only saw 5% higher frame rate with the 2070 Super. But like we just saw, on average the difference was 11%. In general though, it seems that the 2070 Super needs more power than the 2060 Super compared to the extra performance it's offering. Unfortunately, I don't have temperature results here as I didn't collect that data when I had the 2060 Super, which is too bad as they're both the Gaming X model and it would have been good to compare. I do have thermal results from the 2070 Super as well as 4K benchmarks in my full review though. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as prices will change over time. On release, the MSRP of the 2060 Super was $400 while the 2070 Super was $500 So basically 25% more money for an on average 11% higher average frame rate at 1440p in the games I've tested. Unfortunately, I don't currently have US pricing for MSI's RTX 2070 Super Gaming X, as it's not out in the US yet. However, MSI advised me it'll go for $939 Australian dollars here in Australia. Given the 2060 Super Gaming X I used is $759 Australian dollars, that's a similar 24% price increase for the 2070 Super. To me, the 2070 Super starts approaching worse value as you're paying more for not that much of a performance boost. That said, in theory, it is meant to be priced the same as the non-super version it's replacing, so there's that. I think it's going to come down to whether or not you want to pay the extra money for the improvement in games that I've shown. However, the 2060 Super is definitely a more than capable 1080p and 1440p option. It just comes down to the frame rates you want to target. If you're buying today and picking between Nvidia's RTX 2060 Super and 2070 Super, let me know which card you'd pick and why down in the comments. This specific comparison is of course only relative between these two cards. I'm still yet to test out AMD's latest offerings and I'm interested in comparing them when I'm able to get them. So if you're new to the channel, you'll definitely want to get subscribed for future comparisons and tech videos like this one.